I decided to become a composer when I was 6 years old after hearing a recording of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. I'd been listening to a lot of what was then early rock and roll, Little Richard and Elvis Presley. But my mother, who was a member of the Music Appreciation Club, said, well, that's fine, but you might like this too. And it was Norman Del Mar conducting, I think it was the Philharmonia Orchestra in Beethoven's Fifth. And I remember I just sat down and listened to it. It was like the heavens opened up to me. The first piece of quote-unquote modern music I heard was not too long after the Beethoven. It was the Scythian Suite of Prokofiev. This was in the days when you could go into record stores, for people who remember such things, and listen to recordings there. You could sample them on earphones. But when the Scythian Suite came on, and only I could hear it, I thought, wow, this is it, this is it. So I said, this one, Mom, this one, Mommy. So we got that. She hadn't heard it. If she'd heard it, I think she would never have bought it. So when we got home and I put it on the turntable and actually played it, you get that crazy beginning, and the whole rest of it is wild as well. I'll never forget, she went literally running into the kitchen and closed the door. And that was really the beginning of my love for modern music. I knew now that music could be different than just the Beethoven or the other works of the 18th and 19th centuries that I'd been listening to. I'd always loved writing, or the idea of writing for the orchestra. Of course, when you're a student, you tend not to have terribly many opportunities to do that. But just by a series of serendipitous happenstances, when I was at the University of Michigan, my first employment after finishing graduate school, the university orchestra was playing performances on tour, and they needed a 5-minute opener. The music director wanted an American piece on each program, and on one program he needed a 5-minute piece. And he couldn't really come up with something that fit the bill, so he told me the kind of thing he wanted and asked me to write it. Only gave me 3 weeks to do it. But somehow, I could never do it now, but somehow in 3 weeks I wrote the Infernal Machine. So indeed, Gorgon was commissioned by the Rochester Philharmonic. That was David Zinman's doing. And Phantasmata was commissioned by the St. Louis Symphony. And really then it kind of took off from there. I became, I would honestly have to say, typecast as an orchestra composer. But that's fine with me. I love writing for the orchestra. I think I would rather write for the orchestra than anything else. After I finished Phaethon at the beginning of 1986, I took stock of myself and really asked myself, do I want to be known as a niche composer, filling the fast and furious niche for the rest of my life? And so I made a conscious decision to move in the opposite direction. The result was my first symphony. It's a half-hour adagio in one movement. And I had my whole life really been, of course, very concerned. It sounds rather pretentious, I don't know how else to say it, but with issues relating to the human condition. There was a part of me that felt in my 20s I really hadn't been around the block enough times to really write about that. But as I approached my later 30s, I felt that maybe it was time to really address those concerns. And so indeed, for the next 5 years, for the second half of the 1980s, I composed works that were mostly much more tragic in tone, much more about those kinds of issues, human suffering, the loss of one's ideals, the loss of hope, and of course, ultimately, the loss of life. The Trombone Concerto really was the beginning of a kind of a slight turn, shall we say, because from 1990, or 91, when I composed that piece, through 1995, every time I had a new piece to write, somebody died. A death that really had a profound effect on me, and that I felt I needed to respond to in some ways. I had gotten to know Bernstein only in the last year or so of what turned out to be his life. And he had intimated that he had had some involvement in getting that commission for me, although we hadn't known each other. And he even said that he would be interested in possibly conducting the premiere. But by the time I was actually ready to set the piece down on paper, he died. And so what went from being possibly a piece that he might conduct became a requiem. The concerto quotes from Bernstein's own Third Symphony, the Kaddish Symphony. In the final movement, there's a beautiful theme, which I call the credo theme because it is in connection to the narrator always saying, it's also simple once you believe, believe, believe. In my cello concerto, it was the death of William Schumann and Andrei Panufnik, one of whom had been a long-time mentor. Then came the Flute Concerto, which was my response to the death of James Bulger, a little 2-year-old boy in Liverpool who was led away by 2 10-year-old boys from a mall and tortured and ultimately murdered. And that hit me very hard. I had a 2-year-old of my own at the time, and I couldn't help but imagining something like that happening to her, how horrible. The Second Symphony from 1994 was my response to the sudden tragic death of the composer Stephen Albert, another good friend. And then in 1995, Envoi, which was triggered by my mother's death and is the most personal and probably the least public of all of those pieces. It's really kind of almost a private communication, that work. Every once in a while, I think every composer feels the need to write a piece that is just really only for him or only for her. After I finished Envoi in 1995, I again did one of these stock-taking moments, and again, I realized I think it's always important for a composer to try to get away from himself and almost see himself as others see him. And I realized I was now being typecast as the doom and gloom meister. So again, it was a conscious decision that I made to compose music that was more light infused and more life affirming, more optimistic in tone. And for the second half of the 1990s, that was largely what I did through Rapture, which is kind of the culminating work of that group, which was composed in 2000, which is as tonal as I get, and very much meant to have an ecstatic quality to it. After I finished Rapture in 2000, I again came to one of those 5-year taking of stock moments. And because Rapture had gone so far out on one limb of the musical tree, it was so very overtly tonal. The next piece I decided to once again leap to the totally opposite branch as far away as possible on the tree. And I wrote a very prickly pear of a piece in the Clarinet Concerto, which is every bit as uncompromising and angular and dissonant as Rapture is clearly consonant and uplifting. But from that point on, really, since 2000, I haven't had any more 5-year plans. Each piece just becomes its own world. And more recently, I've found myself drawn to the use of a code. I'm certainly not the first composer to do this, but I have a code for spelling names and words, events, people, whatever, in pitches. You know, each letter of the alphabet becomes a certain pitch. The piece that I used it to the most extreme degree was a work that I wrote for the New York Philharmonic called Одна жизнь, which in Russian means a life. Since 2000, there have been all sorts of different works. The main one, of course, would be the Requiem, which is a full evening, 90-minute piece. It's the largest work I've composed. It really embraces pretty much everything I know how to do. It's the piece that of all of my works, it's the one that I feel is the most completely representative because of that. John Nelson was a very important influence in the group Soli Deo Gloria, an American organization that commissions modern liturgical works, shares with me a great love of Berlioz. And so for the Berlioz bicentenary in 2003, he thought I would be a natural to write a Requiem. And so I did use the Berlioz as a starting off point, using the text the way he did, moving things around, cutting things, and so forth. But also I introduced other texts. The chorus sings the Latin text as Berlioz arranged it. But I also have a baritone soloist who represents a kind of an everyman who sings of his life as experienced through the deaths of loved ones around him, starting with the death of a brother in childhood and ending with his own death. When it was time for me to write my third symphony, one of the first things that I have to decide is what the form of any new piece is going to be. And I don't like to repeat forms if I can avoid it, but I was having a little trouble coming up with something. And then I thought of the Second Symphony of Prokofiev, which is one of my very, very favorite works of his, rarely played. I think because the first movement is so savage and ferocious that it scares people off a bit. To me, the most important thing is expressive urgency. I don't think it matters whether a piece is complex or simple, you know, whether it's maximalist or minimalist or tonal or atonal or whatever. That's not nearly as significant as whether a piece communicates something meaningful to a listener. What really matters to me the most is if people feel that connection. If they are moved, excited, if they feel consoled or angered or delighted or whatever it may be. I'm not anticipating that people are going to hear my doing inversions and retrogrades and all sorts of other technical things. What I want my listener to hear or experience is the emotional content, the expressive content, which doesn't always have to plumb the depths of human experience. Sometimes one can write music that's just intended to be visceral, that's intended to be invigorating. But if a listener picks up on that and feels that there is that bond established between me and them, that's what matters most to me.